Some mornings speak louder than words. They don't begin with noise or chaos, but with silence, a deep, almost sacred stillness that wraps around the heart. It was on such a morning that Keaton knew everything was about to change. The sunlight filtered softly through the trees, not in joy, but in respect for the pain he carried, for the step he was about to take. It wasn't just a walk, it was a pilgrimage. A journey toward justice, wrapped in sorrow, trembling with hope. He left the workshop without saying a word. Each step was slow but steady, weighed down by memories that refused to stay buried. The river, the fists, the cold water swallowing his breath, and the face of the man who had once been to Annie's husband Nam. The police station loomed ahead, plain and silent. Keat paused at the door, took a deep breath, and walked in. "Hello," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. The officer behind the desk looked up. "What do you need?" Joa's eyes widened. "You're lucky to be alive," he murmured. "No," Keat replied. "I was saved by a stranger. A girl. Without her, I wouldn't be here." The notebook came out. Each word Keat spoke became a spark in the dark. "We'll begin the investigation immediately." "You're not alone anymore," Joa told him. Keat walked out under the same sun, but the world felt heavier. Not because of fear, but because of what he still had to do. That morning, far from the police station, Tu Na carried her child and her courage through the wild paths of the countryside. Her hands were rough, her clothes faded, her basket patched, but her spirit remained unshaken. Step by step, she made her way to the pumpkin patch, a field of survival and hope. She picked each pumpkin with silent patience. Some were perfect, others twisted, but all were a reward for her labor, each one a symbol of her endurance. With the heavy basket on her back, she walked to the market, her child clinging to her side. "Sweet pumpkins, just 5,000 a kilo." She called out, her voice filled not with energy but faith. By noon, the pumpkins were gone. Tu Na didn't smile for the money. She smiled because she had given her daughter another day of life. Back at the workshop, Keat tried to return to his routine. But the wood no longer smelled the same. The silence of the workshop became a refuge, a place where healing might begin. He stacked the planks, wiped the sweat from his brow, and then made a decision. He had to speak with Nam's mother. The house was still, like it was holding its breath. Keat knocked gently. "Good afternoon, ma'am. I'd like to talk to you." She looked up, her eyes tired but sharp. "Sit down." "What's this about?" Keat didn't flinch. "It's about Nam. He and his friends attacked me. I survived. I'm not here to accuse him, here to ask you, as his mother, to talk to him. Tell him to turn himself in." She rose to her feet, trembling with rage and denial. "My son is not a criminal. Get out." Keat stood. "I understand this is hard. But the truth doesn't go away just because we close our eyes." He walked out without another word. Some hearts aren't ready for the truth. But he still believed that one day, her love would overcome her pride, and she would help her son do the right thing. That evening, as the sun sank low over the hills, Keat walked home. The sky blushed orange and gold, but his heart was still heavy. He passed a clearing filled with logs. Then a scream shattered the calm. "Help! Give me back my money." He ran. 2 figures disappeared into the trees. Keith arrived too late to stop them, but not too late to find a girl collapsed in the dirt, clutching a torn bag, shaking with fear. She looked lost, like a leaf ripped from a tree. "They took everything," she whispered. "I have no one." Keith knelt beside her. Her pain was raw, familiar. "You don't have to be alone," he said quietly. "I have a place. A bench. It's not much, but it's safe. Come with me. Tomorrow, we'll figure out the rest." She looked at him through tears, and nodded. Because sometimes, redemption isn't grand. Sometimes, it's a quiet boy helping a stranger. Sometimes, it's a mother selling pumpkins with hope. Sometimes, it's simply surviving and choosing to keep going. And sometimes, it's the beginning of a new dawn. The workshop was quiet that night, filled only with the scent of wood shavings and the soft creak of old planks. Keith placed a folded blanket on the wooden bench near the back wall and lit a small oil lamp. The girl, still too shaken to say her name, stood by the doorway, her eyes wide and uncertain. "You can rest here," Keith said gently. "It's not much, but it's safe. No one will bother you." She stepped inside slowly, as if afraid the ground might disappear beneath her feet. Her hands trembled as she held on to the tattered strap of her bag, but there was something deeper than fear in her eyes, something raw and hollow. The look of someone who hadn't felt safe in a very long time. Keith didn't press her with questions. He simply nodded and returned to the workbench, pretending to busy himself with tools, giving her space to breathe. She sat for a long time. Neither of them spoke. The night outside was still, broken only by the chirp of crickets and the occasional distant bark of a dog. The lamp flickered gently, casting soft shadows across the walls. Then, finally, a whisper. "My name is Lean." He looked up. Her voice was dry, barely audible, but it carried the weight of trust. "Lean," he repeated softly, as if saying her name could make her real again. "They took everything," she continued, eyes fixed on the floor. "My savings, my papers. I was going to start a new life. But now, I don't even have bus fare." Keith's hands clenched slightly at her words. He knew what it was like to have nothing but breath left in your lungs, even that stolen for a moment. "You can stay here until you find your footing," he said. "I'll help where I can." She looked up at him. "Why are you being kind to me?" He paused, then gave a faint smile. "Because someone once saved me, too." The next morning, the sun poured gently through the wooden shutters, painting lines of gold across the workshop floor. Lean was still asleep, curled on the bench, her bag tucked beneath her head like a fragile pillow. Keith moved quietly, setting a kettle of water on the fire and slicing a few pieces of bread. By the time the smell of tea filled the air, Lean stirred. She sat up slowly, brushing dust from her sleeves. Keith handed her a steaming mug. "It's not much, but it's warm." She took it with both hands. "Thank you, again." They ate in silence, the kind of silence that felt safe. Later that morning, Keith took her with him to the river's edge, not the place where he was attacked, but a peaceful bend surrounded by grass and low trees. He handed her a small pail. "Want to help me gather water? The pump's broken." She nodded. It felt good to be useful. As they walked back, Leanne finally asked, "What happened to you?" Keith hesitated. Then, slowly, he told her. About Nam, about the river, about Tuna and her daughter, about Officer Joa and the conversation with Nam's mother. He didn't dramatize it. He didn't need to. The truth, in its simplicity, was heavy enough. "You could have died," Lean said quietly, almost reverently. "I know," Keith replied, "but I didn't. So now, I have to make sure others don't have to go through what I did." Lean looked at him differently after that, not just as a kind stranger, but as someone who had earned his quiet strength, someone who had rebuilt himself plank by plank. That afternoon, while Lean swept the floor of the workshop, Keith went to the market. He bought a bit of rice, some dried fish, and 2 second-hand shirts. When he returned, Lean laughed softly. "You didn't have to," she said, eyes wide with surprise. "I know, but it's cold at night." The days passed slowly, with the rhythm of wood and sawdust and small, shared moments. Lean helped him sand down planks. Keith taught her how to use the hammer safely. Little by little, her shoulders relaxed. Her laughter returned quiet and uncertain at first, like someone remembering how to breathe. But underneath it all, Keith knew something. Nam was still out there, and justice hadn't been served yet. He couldn't hide in the comfort of small peace forever. One evening, as they finished their meal under the stars, Leanne asked, "What will you do next?" "I'll go to the city," Keith said, his eyes fixed on the night sky. "Nam may be hiding there. The police need more witnesses, more proof. And I have to speak to Tuna again. She deserves to know everything." Lean's eyes dimmed. "Will you come back?" Keith turned to her, his voice firm. "Yes. And when I do, I hope this place feels like home for both of us." Life lesson: the strength of compassion and the courage to speak the truth. This story teaches us that even in our darkest moments, kindness and courage can guide us forward. Keith could have chosen silence, fear, or revenge. But instead, he chose to face the truth, even when it was painful. He went to the police, not just to seek justice for himself, but to protect others. That act of bravery planted a seed of hope in a place once filled with fear. Tuna, despite her poverty and hardship, showed us the quiet strength of a mother's love working under the sun. Walking miles, never giving up, all for the sake of her child. Lean's story reminds us how quickly life can fall apart, but also how powerful a simple act of compassion can be. With nothing to give but a place to sleep and warm tea, Keith gave her what the world had taken from her: dignity and safety. In a world full of pain and injustice, the smallest acts of goodness can be seeds of transformation. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson. When we dare to be kind and brave enough to speak up, we become the light someone else is waiting for.